Welcome. This is the first Early Career Network webinar of GLP. Just very briefly, GLP is an interdisciplinary and international community of science and practice around land systems. And before jumping straight to our webinar, which is about knowledge sharing, a super exciting topic, I have a very short introduction about the Early Career Network, particularly for those who don't know it or who haven't joined yet. So I will briefly share my screen and tell you a bit about that, and then we will officially start the webinar. Let me know if you can see my screen. Yeah?
Yeah, it works. Yeah.
Okay, cool. Thanks. So the Early Career Network is an initiative from the GLP. We started this initiative in late 2023, I think, and throughout last year, we had different virtual activities like webinars and newsletters to try to, get people interest and engagement. And then in November last year, during the Open Science meeting of GLP in Mexico, we had the first Early Career Network in-person meeting with a bunch of participants from diverse backgrounds and regions. And there we sort of brainstormed what we wanted this network to be, how we wanted it to function, what kind of activities we could do. For those who participated in this event, you will hear about from us very shortly, because we are putting together all the great input that you provided, and we are trying to think of ways in which we can follow up and continue working together throughout the year. So you will hear from us very, very soon. But the Early Career Network is open to anyone who wants to join. And mostly the reason why we wanted to have an Early Career Network is because we thought that it was like a missing element of our organizational structure. We have a lot of early career researchers and practitioners within GLP, and we wanted to create a specific space in which we can interact. So some of the things that we want to do is we want to provide this space for networking, for collaboration. We also want to have capacity strengthening activities, but focusing on the needs that you identify. And for example, knowledge sharing was something that came out a lot during our event in the OSM. We also want to expand the representation of diverse voices and backgrounds within GLP. And we really think that GLP can nourish a lot from the innovative ideas and new perspectives of early career researchers and practitioners. And we thought about different ways in which we can achieve that, particularly during the Early Career Network Day. For example, we will continue having webinars and other training initiatives. We have a newsletter. We have also a Slack channel to interact, in a more constant and regular basis. We are going to have Early Career Network Days at the upcoming Open Science meetings of GLP. And then, like I said before, there are a lot of other emerging activities and initiatives that you proposed during the Early Career Network Day, and we are thinking of how we can promote them and maybe organize a few during the year, throughout the year. So before I pass it over, before I pass it over to Laura for the webinar, I wanted to explain how you can join the network. Like I said before, this network is envisioned as a dynamic space, so we hope that it can also be shaped by you and by the ideas that you propose. So you're super, super welcome to join. The first thing to join is sending an email to Caitlin. She's a member of the International Program Office of GLP. And in that email, you can express that you want to register to the Early Career Network, and you have to provide a few materials, a picture for the website, etc. And then in this QR code, you have access to the Slack channel. In that channel, we communicate all the upcoming activities. And I must say it's a bit inactive now, so that's also an objective, we can promote more activity within the Slack. But you can access there, and you will be a notice of all the upcoming activities of the network. So with that, I will pass it over to Laura, who will introduce the webinar.
Great, thank you very much, Sophia. Then I will just share my screen. Okay, do you see it? Yeah, I take that as a yes.
Yes, we see.
Okay, great. So I'm very excited to have this webinar today on knowledge sharing because it's really something that has become quite important to me. And the question we will discuss today is how we can actually make research more accessible to the people who can benefit from it. So the agenda for the next hour or so is that I will firstly say a few words on like why, when, and how to engage in broad knowledge sharing. And then I will turn it over to our two excellent speakers, Dr. Emilie Vansant, who is a postdoc at University of Copenhagen, and then Dr. Vimbayi Chimonyo, who is based at CIMMYT in Zimbabwe. But first, what do we actually mean when we say broad knowledge sharing? So as PhDs and postdocs, then you have to engage in academic knowledge sharing in the form of, for example, journal articles, books, or monographs. So it can also be conference presentations. So for example, at the GLP Open Science meeting. But your academic research can then feed into what I will call two broad types of knowledge sharing. So first, there is knowledge sharing with policymakers, which is typically in the form of written policy briefs or dialogue events. And second, then there is knowledge sharing with citizens or the public. And these days, then this can take a lot of interesting and very creative forms, such as podcasts or community workshops, educational materials for schools. It can be apps and games or theater. And where these two types overlap, then we have press releases based on your academic research. And with press releases, then you typically try to reach both the policymakers, but also the public. And I will say that the field of broad knowledge sharing, that has really evolved a lot as compared to 15 years ago when I did my PhD. At that time, we would really only think of broad knowledge sharing in the terms of written policy briefs. So it is really, really exciting that we are now working with so many different formats of knowledge sharing. Okay, so when you engage in broad knowledge sharing, then the key question to ask here is like, who is actually your target group? So your target group can, for example, be policymakers. It can also be your research respondents. It can be local communities beyond your research respondents. It can be agricultural extension workers, the public. It can be students. And the tricky thing is then to really select the right format of knowledge sharing based on your target group. And to give you two quite different examples, then first you see a children's book that Emilie will tell you more about. And the target group here was Emilie's study communities. And the format really should be sort of one that could be easily stored and shared. Then on the right side, you have a second example. And here the target group was NGOs working on tree planting in Malawi. And when going into this knowledge sharing project, then we really thought that they wanted an app. But it turned out that what they actually wanted was a quite technical printed guide on tree planting. So this is just to give you two very different examples. Okay, so before engaging in a massive knowledge sharing project, then I will say that you might also want to be clear about why you're doing this in the first place. It could simply be because it's a requirement from funders. It could also be because you wish to give something back to the communities where you have worked. So we avoid doing what I think is okay to call a very extractive research. And then it could also be that you actually see this as a way of doing some mutual learning and a knowledge exchange. So finally, then the question is when in a given project cycle to actually engage in broad knowledge sharing. And I would say that the common strategy is to think about this as something you do towards the very end when you have some nice polished results. But I think it's quite important here to highlight that it can surely also be done, for example, at the outset. And this could serve to inform about upcoming activities and actually also engage participants or communities more in the research that is about to be done. And then you can also do it in the interim, where it could be a way of validating some results. So just to say, there are many options. It doesn't only have to happen towards the end. So my final words will be that the broader knowledge sharing, of course, will have to be balanced with your other PhD and postdoc requirements, and this is both in terms of time and financial means. And on that note, I will turn it over to Emilie.
Thanks, Laura. All right, I'll share my screen. Okay, I hope this is successful.
Yeah, you can see.
Thumbs up. Okay, great. All right. Thank you, Laura, for the introduction. As she said, my name's Emilie. I'm a postdoc at the University of Copenhagen, and I'm going to present the dissemination component from my PhD, which I did with Laura. So we've worked together for some years now. So that's why she's very familiar with all of this work in Malawi. And so I will, just to outline my presentation, I'm going to start with a relatively quick overview of the data that we transformed, the dissemination project, and then some of my reflections following this project and how it can be applied to other contexts. So to begin, the data is from my PhD, which I conducted in Malawi, and I wrapped up in 2023. And the primary research question I looked at through my PhD was linking tree-based landscapes and diets. And for those of you that haven't dealt with this very specific question, it comes from this paradox of right now we're producing more food than we ever have before in history, yet 1 in 3 people experience malnutrition. And this is because conventional agricultural policies still tend to support the production of calorie-rich staples like maize, rice, and wheat in very simplified farming systems. And this happens often at the expense of forests and other biodiverse landscapes. So we're seeing these global co-trends of dietary simplification and landscape simplification. So through my PhD, I really wanted to find out how trees, as an important source of nutritious food, for example, fruits, nuts, seeds, and leafy vegetables, how trees can help reverse these co-trends of dietary and landscape simplification and be part of a solution to support both people and nature. And so I chose to focus my research in Malawi. And Malawi was an appropriate case study place for studying these linkages because it represents this confluence of high rates of poverty, deforestation, and malnutrition. So for example, the population is approaching 21 million, for which Malawi is a relatively small country in Southeast Africa. It's very densely populated, with 80% of the population living in rural areas and 62% living in multidimensional poverty. Now, 4% of this rural population has access to electricity. So as you can imagine, there's huge demand for biomass to support household energy needs. And this is one of the main drivers of deforestation. The country has lost 247,000 hectares of tree cover since 2001. And this represents about 16% of total tree cover. On top of this, because of this promotion of staple grains, largely to address food insecurity concerns, a lot of the population experiences malnutrition, and some indicators of malnutrition include stunting. So for example, 37% of children are stunted, and 31% of women of reproductive age are anemic, meaning they have low iron intake. So these are just some stats, but trying to paint a picture of Malawi that is experiencing this relationship between landscapes and people's nutrition. And that's why it was an optimal place to do research. So I visited the country several times with enumerators, research assistants, where we did household surveys and other field work in a northern area with a higher degree of tree cover, as you can see from the photo, and a southern area with a relatively lower degree of tree cover. I won't go into too much detail with the methods, but basically in both dry and wet seasons, we conducted a household survey with over 460 households. a dietary quality survey where we got information on the food people were consuming, where it came from and how much, agroforestry field survey to understand trees on farms, how they were used, and in what density, and the cultural values surrounding those foods. And then focus groups also to dig into more of the nuances around wild food collection in different areas. So my analysis revealed that higher tree cover and food trees on farms are linked to higher micronutrient adequacy. What that means is if people lived in areas with more trees, and especially if they cultivated trees on their farm for food, people were, or at least the women that we surveyed, were consuming more adequate intakes of specific micronutrients like vitamin A, folate, iron, and zinc, all of which have implications for people's health. They're very important for basic nervous system functioning. So we could see that these trees were making direct contributions to people's nutrition, but not just food trees. Multi-purpose trees, meaning trees that provided also income and fuel, also provided nutrient benefits for people, while they also provided other additional livelihood benefits. So essentially, by showing how trees in the landscape can benefit people's nutrition, these studies supported can support agroforestry and reforestation projects and other landscape restoration initiatives, with the goal of improving the availability of wild and tree-based foods in the landscape. That's generally what these findings support, is that trees can help people's diets. And so those are the types of programs that these sort of findings can help support. However, what I want to focus on today is in the study communities, I was commonly asked, how will this benefit us, or when will I see the results? And these are really fair questions. As you can see from these methods, we went to households, we conducted these long surveys, conducted dietary recall surveys, I conducted agroforestry surveys, asking people to take me in tours around their fields so I could count trees in 2 different seasons. So this demanded a lot of time from people, and it's entirely fair that they want to know what was their time contributing towards. And so the fact that I received so many of these questions, to me, really communicated the need for a bottom-up dissemination strategy where we could share our findings directly with our survey respondents in a format that could be easily stored and easily shared. Too often, I find research in these sort of contexts perpetuates these long-standing power asymmetries or neocolonialist dynamics, or as Laura said, can be rather extractive. And traditionally, academic institutions in these Western countries can be gatekeepers of knowledge, which we often see reinforced by these practices of selective admission or high journal publishing fees, and inequitable distribution of funding resources. So, of course, with our project, we can't reverse all of that, but it does motivated me and motivated our team to look at ways where we could flip the switch a little bit and think about how we can design a dissemination strategy that starts with the people that were the core of our study and acknowledges them as participants in that study. So the strategy was to, as I said, acknowledge respondents' participation, their time investment in advancing this field of study, and communicate our results in a way to help preserve knowledge and awareness around Indigenous and nutritious foods. So by packaging our results in a format that can be easily disseminated in our study areas, we wanted to also emphasize the importance of forests and trees for nutrition at our various target audiences, and then make this crucial link between human health and biodiversity stewardship, which often is from a policy perspective, but I think most of us think of these 2 things as very separate. And so that was a key aspect of our strategy as well. So what did we end up doing? I'm now going to get into this actual dissemination component. So when I was visiting households for the surveys, respondents would often lament how the younger generation in particular seems to know less and less about wild foods, including indigenous tree species and leafy vegetables. So as the abundance of these species is reduced with this landscape simplification and agricultural expansion, so is the knowledge that these foods exist and can be an important source of micronutrients. So in collaboration with Laura and our project team, we planned this dissemination trip to transform some of this knowledge and give it back, so to speak, in the form of a children's book and a seasonal calendar. These, you can call them knowledge products, were based off of our data on commonly consumed wild foods in each study area. And the book is called My Little Guide to Wild Foods. It's translated in the local language. The seasonal calendars were adapted specifically for each study area based on wild species consumed in the region. The calendar shows, you can see different lines for each species. Those show what foods are available on the farm, in the bush, and in the forest at different months of the year. And our goal with these projects, besides the goals I've already mentioned, was also just to highlight the abundance of nutritious foods in the landscape, and in doing so, encourage their conservation. So in March 2023, we went to Malawi and presented these books in 8 schools through interactive workshops with our local colleagues at the Lilongwe University of Agriculture and Natural Resources. We read the book with the kids. We talked about how wild foods are good for the body and for the mind. And then we did a drawing exercise where they drew wild foods that they recognized in the landscape. In communities, we conducted 12 workshops with around 15 women each from our study villages, and we wanted a mix of respondents and non-respondents, meaning people who were already involved in the project and then those who were not, to encourage sharing of the information in the wider community. So in these workshops, we shared a summary of the results from our study, highlighting how women in areas with higher tree cover had higher dietary quality. And in doing so, we also wanted to see how our results resonated with people and share them in a way that was easily understood and have a discussion around it. In addition, we also presented them, as many of the mothers or the women there had children in the schools, we also showed them the book and to engage them in that activity as well. And then we presented the seasonal calendar adapted to the study area and said that this was a presentation of knowledge that they had given us in the focus groups. By taking the time to present these foods and stress their nutritional importance, our goal was also to help validate the consumption of wild foods and products from indigenous tree species, because often the consumption of these species are stigmatized as poor people's food. So we wanted to help kind of reverse that stigma by validating these foods as important sources of micronutrients. And now I'm going to just wrap up because I have some reflections on this process. Overall, I can say that we were received really well by local authorities who lamented how infrequently researchers actually came back to share results in places they collect data. And so that leads me to quickly discuss how I believe outreach such as this can be an important precursor to impact. Even at a relatively small scale, I think such activities can lay the groundwork for further programs adapted to developing more products, sharing knowledge to lay the groundwork for greater impact. So what I mean is making research accessible to those who may directly benefit from it. And what important things to factor into this are that the process or the strategy of transforming data into knowledge. So using mixed methods for communication, knowing your target audience. For example, we adapted our workshops for the children and then the women in our communities. Cultivating robust local networks, so working with knowledge brokers, which is essentially a term for individuals who play a significant role in your communities and may be able to facilitate or help with trust building and facilitate these dialogues with target audiences. And third, responsibly managing these asymmetric power dynamics, because at the end of the day, we were the ones coming in with these products. And in doing so, we really wanted to stress that the book and the calendar are repackaged versions of the knowledge that people have already given us. And we just repackaged it and are giving it back. We're not there to teach them, but we're actually showing how much we benefited from things that we learned by doing research in those communities. So when done well, I think these types of tailored outreach activities have the potential to instigate change on the ground. That being said, it's not always possible to effectively do this sort of work. I think we were very fortunate to be able to carve out the funding in the parent project I know this is not the case, especially for many PhDs, so I consider myself very lucky to have had this opportunity. I'm going to wrap up with just describing some of the challenges. So first of which being, as I just mentioned, carving out time and funding and project plans, balancing between contextual relevance and scalability. So the books and the calendars were designed for those study areas, but ideally you'd want to make something that's scalable, and they are, as long as the species are grown in different areas, but that's a tricky balance to make. And then finally, taking the leap from outreach to impact. What sort of monitoring and evaluation mechanisms need to be in place? I think in ideal scenarios, measuring the impact of knowledge sharing could help researchers develop new avenues to effectuate change through their findings, or at the very least, provide a foundation to build on findings through future research or applied projects. So I see this as an important first step, and a very practical use of broad knowledge sharing in research. Thank you. You're welcome to reach out if I can follow up with any more details.
Great. Thank you very much, Emilie. So then I will hand it over to Vimbayi, and we will take questions after Vimbayi's presentation. And please do remember to put them in the chat also, so we can collect all the questions.
All right. Afternoon, good day, good morning to everyone. My name is Vimbayi Chimonyo. I'm with CIMMYT Zimbabwe, and I'm a crop modeler. I'll be talking to you today about disseminating modeling research. Just give me a few seconds to just put up my slides. No, it's not happening. Okay. Can you see my slides?
Yes.
Now I need to convert this to, oh, there's something went wrong, just hold on. Oh no. Okay, let me try and see if I can. Okay. Then I need to swap. It's just giving me a split screen right now, so I'm trying to see how I can fix that.
So we are seeing the slide, the use of visual aids.
Yes. Is this better?
Yes. Now we see the fact sheet.
Okay. So, there,
Okay,
I think this is better.
Now we
for
see
that
the
little
front page.
Again, I'm presenting you about my experiences in broad dissemination of crop modeling research. Again, I'm a crop modeler with CIMMYT, but I work mostly in diverse agroecosystems where there's this need for me to communicate my results from for different stakeholders, be it farmers, extension, policymakers, and fellow researchers. And one would be asking, why models? What are models and why are they important? So a lot of the work that we do is trying to see how we can depict the current existing systems, present them in maybe mathematical formulas or even conceptual frameworks. And all these are regarded as models. So briefly, one can say that scientific models are a representation of an idea, an object, a process, or a system. And they help us to understand and predict the phenomena. So these can be physical, mathematical, or conceptual. And they help us to explain, predict, and more importantly, communicate. But when we look at it from the perspective of crop science or ecology, we have what we call crop simulation models. And these crop simulation models are more of like a quantitative description of the agrophysiological processes and systems that can predict plant growth development as influenced by environmental conditions and crop management. A lot of it is, how do we take data that we
Oh no. Sofia, is Vimbayi also frozen for you?
Yes, she's frozen.
Oh. Let's hope
Maybe.
that she comes back. Let's give it a few minutes.
Okay, let's give it a few minutes for her to come back. Okay, I think she got disconnected now.
Yeah.
Maybe we can see if there are questions for Emilie meanwhile.
Yes, good idea.
I don't know if someone has a question for her. I can go ahead. I have a few questions. Thanks, Emilie. I really liked your presentation.
Thank you.
I wanted to ask, how did you come up with the idea of that specific format? I mean, a book for knowledge sharing, and maybe more broadly, if you have thoughts about how to select like an adequate format. I don't know.
I think, yeah, it's hard to know what format there. I feel like there's becoming more and more examples of formats that are inspiring, and you see researchers delving into this area more and more. I remember when we were thinking about it, we saw examples of comic books, we saw examples of coloring books. What inspired us, I believe, to look at a children's book specifically was again this feeling that the younger generation was missing out or slowly, or not being exposed to, I should say, a lot of this traditional knowledge around where to find wild foods that have high nutritional value. So I think that at the base of it, or at the root of it, was our inspiration for doing a children's book. And then the seasonal calendars was based on a focus group activity we did. So that also felt appropriate to transform into something that could be more widely distributed.
Great.
Great.
Thank you.
And I see that Vimbayi is back now. So Vimbayi, are you ready to try sharing your screen again and continue? Oh, you're muted.
Apologies for that.
No worries.
No worries.
In Africa, there's load shedding and my backup system failed me. I'm so sorry about that. I hope you can still follow. As I was saying, so we have crop simulation models, and a lot of these models are data intensive. But this data, we take it and we try and make sense of it. So as we're trying to make sense of it, we try and transform it into knowledge, insights, and hopefully we get to a stage where we generate some form of wisdom. But in many instances, because of the reductionistic processes that we do when we collect our data and analyze our data, we always get to a stage where we come up with conspiracy theories. And this is what we don't want to do. We want to be able to inform people such that we can actually provide recommendations that move communities from one state of being to another in a sustainable manner. So how do we do this in such a way that we take our data, we add some levels of confidence to it, and we present it to the different communities that we work with? So a lot of it is trying to make sure that when we do collect our data, we don't underfeed or overfeed some of these data points, but we make sure that at the end of the day, we have a certain level of complexity that we have confidence in. I always love this illustration where someone talks about crop models as if it's Houdini looking through this glass ball and just predicting figures to say that, oh no, your yields will be low because you've used X, Y, and Z. And that level of skepticism that's there within models actually is prevalent in our society nowadays. So we need to be able to communicate our results to a diverse set of actors, and also make sure that there is a level of at least scrutiny in the processes, and also confidence in the data that we have. So how do we do it? I think from Laura and Emilie, I think they have touched on a lot of this principle where we talk about know your audience. It's pointless for me to come to a smallholder farmer and tell them that we have used crop models to predict that your yield is going to be low. They'll tell you, what are you talking about? You go to a policymaker. What they want to know is, how will I get votes? So it's pointless to tell them about the crop model itself, but more about the impact that your crop model is actually predicting. Simplify your language, definitely. As scientists, we tend to use a lot of jargon. And also, I think one of the things that we fall prey when we are like early career researchers is we need to talk smart. Talking smart is not always the way to go. Simple language, because that simple language is easy to understand and digest. We talk about visual visualize effectively. And I think Emilie, with her book, she's actually managed to show that sometimes these visuals can have a long-lasting impact. Contextualize your findings. Tell a story. There's always a story to be told. Engage in dialogues. Use clear conclusions and recommendations. Utilize multiple channels and follow up. So in my presentation going forward, I think I'm going to rely more on some of these different means of how one can communicate effectively. I think Laura spoke about fact sheets, and I've used these a lot to actually transmit the information that I want. Nothing about the model, but more of what the model is telling us. These things are more easy to understand, they are shareable, and also they just focus on the key message. What is your key message? But they do have limitations. They're limited in terms of their depth. They lack, they have a high risk of being misinterpreted. And also the information is static. Static being that the information is for the now and is not dynamic and temporal across scale. We also have policy briefs, and I think also touched on by Laura, with this kind of like targets policymakers and is often used for strategic planning. They're more concise, they're action-oriented. They tell you what to do and what not to do. They influence, and it's more for advocacy. But they're limited in scope, depends on the presentation of the facts, and we often know how that can definitely sway votes left or right. And in many instances, they're oversimplified. We have our usual scientific presentations. You've got your conferences and your seminars and your meetings. In many instances, a lot of the seminars that I've attended as a crop modeler have fellow crop modelers or people who have a basic understanding of the models themselves, what they are, how they function, and most of their limitations. But they also provide an opportunity for us to network, to share knowledge and updates about these particular models, and also for professional visibility. But the unfortunate thing is that they cost a lot of money. Your flight tickets if you have to go abroad, visa and accommodation. And also they have variable impact. Some people might consider work that you're working on innovative, some not so much. But what do you do with the non-scientific group? So one of the things that we've been doing in Zimbabwe under the agroecology initiative that has just finished and that is now transformed into multifunctional landscape is how do we then use these various tools as crop models to actually show impact of certain innovations or adoption of these innovations in terms of agroecology transitions. So we decided to do participatory modeling with farmers, where at the end of the day, we wanted to actually understand what the context is. Can we model? Can we actually model with the farmers and provide feedback? So at the end of the day, participatory modeling is when you actually go with your laptop, with your models and everything, to your intended beneficiaries. You sit down with them, and then you construct the model. After you construct the model, you then move the different indicators on different dials with the farmer so that they can actually see what could happen if they change certain decisions in terms of how they operate. So it integrates obviously local knowledge, it's context specific, but more importantly, it empowers communities and improves issues of ownership, especially for decisions made. So a lot of it is defining the context, and I think Emilie was quite on spot in terms of issues of context, because different areas have different contexts. So we definitely need to define that context, articulate what the objectives of those communities are, then formulate possible interventions with the communities, and then we run the model. After we run the model, we do an iterative process of feedback loops where people actually get a chance to collect data, feedback into the model. We model, show them the results, do an iterative process and say that this could be a possible intervention of this particular issue, and we go again. So if you want to represent that, this is what we did. We had farmers describing their contexts. Then we measured certain indicators. We modeled using APSIM. We ran scenarios. Farmers planted. We collected data. That data fed back into the context assessment to then say, what is it? And we put it back into the model. We are in our second year of iteration as we speak. So when we look at this, kind of like messy and hard to follow. So farmers, because they've worked with us through all the steps, they do understand. But if we're going to show this to people, they might get a bit hazy and fuzzy on what the steps are. So one of the things that we then realize is that visualizing some of these processes is very important. So we came up with this little thing. Look at it. I think most of you guys are smiling right now to say, wow, from this messy representation of the system to this. Farmers understood this, by the way. For them, it was like, wow, this is much neater, and this is exactly what we are doing, right? And if you want to think about it, this is actually what we were doing within the deed cycle when we described, explain, explore, and design, right? And there was that iterative process. And so this is one way we actually then were able to disseminate some of the modeling results from the grassroots core design to the farmers themselves. And also using such diagrams, we then were also able to do that for researchers, with researchers as well. But one of the things that we want to do and move forward to is to then talk about impact. One of the things that we talked about, one of the functions of model is they can help us to then assess the level of impact. So we have the before, we have some of the risk factors, and now what we need to do is to plug other forms of models that can help us to then define the social economic dimension of some of the things that we're doing. So we've gone from the the usual way of disseminating policy briefs and fact shares. We've tried to disseminate also within smallholder systems, but there are also some non-conventional ways in which people can disseminate information. And a lot of us are using social media to reach a lot of our network that we are currently nestled in. I always like this example of this lady that printed her whole thesis on a scarf and she wears it around, and those people that notice get a chance to read a snippet of it. And I think this is one of those innovative ways in which one can disseminate the information about the research that they are doing. I have presented in this flash kind of like talks to different DGs and board of directors, where at the end of the day, I have tried to explain to them the importance of using models to predict a variety of outcomes and what those outcomes can mean in terms of the type of research that we do here in CIMMYT. And a lot of this has been posted on your Twitter, your Blue Sky. And this is one way that all of us can actually use to disseminate some of the information that we generate during our research careers. And I think Laura mentioned that sometimes you need to leave a bit of breadcrumbs before you actually get to the so what of one's research. And this is good avenues to do so. We all have LinkedIn profiles, I'm assuming, but how have you built your LinkedIn profile to speak to the research interests that you have? Sometimes it's the matter of following the right people that speak to some of those research objectives that you're working on. Sometimes it's just going to these communities and having conversations with people who are experts and also sharing some of your research findings. And this is a way in which you can build a profile around yourself and also disseminate information that is relevant to your research. One thing that we have done is to use roadshows to try and disseminate information around forecasts. So, for instance, we could have modeled how an emerging El Nino could affect your yield in upcoming months. So we can also do these roadshows to then let communities that have less access to information or different platforms to know what they can anticipate based on either seasonal forecast or even certain decisions in policy around different inputs. And this is a less used way of disseminating advisory information, but it's very effective, especially in areas that are remote. And there are other ways that we can use, a lot of it obviously being in journal articles, using open source platforms where you can join. For instance, GitHub is open source and you can actually put some of your information there. And a lot of the people who are now very tech savvy use these platforms to access information and data. So these publications that I put here, a lot of the information or the software behind it has been published on GitHub and is easily accessible. In conclusion, I go back to this workflow where we talk about the 9, let's just talk about principles of disseminating your research. And a lot of it cannot be understated, but you need a combination of probably all 9 of these for your dissemination to actually work. And with that, thank you for your interest.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Vimbayi. I think this is a very nice way of ending the 2 presentations in terms of saying that there are many, many options, and it's very inspiring with all these creative ways of sharing your knowledge. So, Sofia, will you manage the questions?
Sure, of course. So now we have around 10 minutes for questions and answers. So we have a few questions in the chat, but also feel free to just unmute yourselves and ask. And thank you both for the 3 of you for those great presentations. I love them. So I will start. We have first a question for Emilie by Daniel. He's asking, based on your experience, how do you see the trajectory from formulating research questions to achieving meaningful impact with a research project? Or in other words, how to pose research questions that have higher impact potential? I think it can be answered by both of you if you want.
Okay, thank you. That's a really great question. I think I'll start by saying that it's very hard well, meaningful impact is a hard phrase to tackle and often is not achievable in the time span of a PhD project. I mean, it depends on, of course, what scale you're working, but often it occurs outside of a project trajectory. And I think there are ways you can effectuate your research to perhaps lead to meaningful impact down the line, even if you aren't directly driving that impact. And one suggestion I have for doing that is when you conduct your research, and of course mine had human participants, so this was a bit straightforward. Focus on nurturing relationships with those that you want to benefit most directly from your research. So of course, an important part of dissemination and knowledge sharing is posting your findings for broadly for a large audience. But if you have audiences that you really care about being able to digest and use your research immediately, then I think nurturing relationships and having this relational approach where you have long-term or two-way dialogues with participants is a way to really understand what they want and what they can use. And this can be done just by iterative processes of talking to your respondents or your communities, or understanding what they might find useful about your research. And that's going to be different, of course, depending on the audience. So I'll just use my project as an example. As I said, people were lamenting that the younger generation didn't have access to this knowledge. Okay, so we do a children's book. But on the other hand, we have NGOs and we have, agricultural extension agents that are more interested in what species are delivering nutrition benefits. This is all part of the same batch of research findings from the same project, but we're just extracting and transforming bits of the findings and transforming it into things that are useful for different audiences. So I think it's not so much about the research question, but rather the process itself. If you do a research project with integrity and really pay attention to how your results can be useful to different people, then that can perhaps set the groundwork for meaningful impact down the line.
Thank you, Emily. I will go to the next question. So it's more like a clarification question for you. And they are asking if you used external illustrations for the book, illustrators for the book, or if you did them yourself.
I cannot take credit for those book illustrations. That was the work of a very talented graphic facilitator and illustrator named Mette Jepsen. She's based in Denmark. I did do the seasonal calendars myself on Adobe Illustrator, but if you go back to that slide, you'll see that there's a big difference in artistic capability between the two. But we hired an external illustrator. Yeah.
Thanks. And finally, other question for you. It's a question about the picture book, and they ask if it was useful to communicate with ordinary stakeholders and policymakers besides the school children.
I think so. Of course, the message of the book is very simple, so it was not designed to really communicate our findings to policymakers or other stakeholders, because essentially the book is just about showing the diversity of nutritious foods in the landscape and talking about how they're important for nutrition. But the creation of the book in itself actually garnered a lot of interest from educators in Malawi and in the US as well, Malawian educators, I mean, and just so a global interest in it as a knowledge product and a way of transforming your findings. So yeah, yes, to some extent.
Thanks. And then we have other questions for both of you, asking if there is any app or software that you would like to recommend to illustrate the visual aids.
Vimbayi, do you want to take this one first?
Unfortunately, I don't really know any visual app or software that one can use. A lot of people now are relying on AI to make their visuals, but they have their limitations. For us here in CIMMYT, we do have a graphic designer, but these guys don't come cheap. So within your communities, I think, especially the universities, there should be people who are within that space that you can link up with. I think that's one of the importance of having these social networks where you team up as colleagues and come up with these things, right? So try and engage with other people who are in the space and try and see if you can also prop up their profiles in this way. They're also propping up your own profile.
I'll follow up by saying that besides using resources at your institution, I personally use Canva a lot for presentations, and then the Adobe Suite. And I know both of those options have there's free versions, but then there's also they both have paid subscriptions. So I think there are free equivalents of those software. I'm not quite familiar with them, but otherwise, potentially, if your institution has access to this software, both have worked great for me.
So
Thank
can I
you
just
both.
add one thing
Yeah.
to that also? So I'm not very good at drawings. But when I at some point did a class with the students where they had to draw some sort of findings, then it turned out that there were a lot of really talented students within the class. And I think that many people are just not used to using drawings as a tool, but they are actually really, really good at it. So I think also you can think about this in a way that it doesn't have to be like very polished and done by a graphic facilitator, like simple drawings also done by local people or your students or whoever you want to engage can also be quite powerful.
Thank you, Laura. We have a few minutes for maybe one more question if someone wants to ask. I have a question or more maybe a reflection, something that I would like to ask you based on your experience, Vimbayi. I really like the steps that you provided. I think they were super useful. But I was wondering, what is your perception? Because we know that mostly academic institutions seem to still be more focused on publishing research articles. So, or do you think that institutions are giving more importance to this kind of outreach and knowledge dissemination, or how do you cope with that struggle of having to publish and also doing all that, which is quite time and knowledge demanding?
So I'll probably have 2 or 3 answers for you. So a lot of institutes have actually shifted their focus to just having these academic type publications because they don't reach as many people as you want them to reach. They're quite limited because of access, internet, and also some of these platforms are paid platforms. So because of that, we are now being asked to broaden our dissemination tools, and it's things that come in even when we are applying for funding, as they also insist that we use different methods of dissemination. So nowadays you find the more you actually speak up on your Twitter, your Blue Sky, and even within different communities, the more you actually get recognition. In addition to that, the publications then form part and parcel of even your KPIs. So nowadays, it's just not how many publications you've done, but how many book chapters you've done, how many blogs, and how many other ways you've actually showcased your research findings. So this now also contributes to your KPIs. In many instances, you find I always want to make sure that people work with me whilst we are doing our research from the inception, where we kind of like define the context to the different type of research questions that come out based on our interactions with stakeholders. So now it's more like if farmers want more boreholes, we try and see if we can actually do an article around the gap that's there and possible ways of finding a solution. We identify a solution and we try and do, for instance, a little review or even a stakeholder meeting. So all these methods, we've kind of like tried to incorporate them in how we do our research, because we now realize that we still need to engage the people who matter, and the people who matter are often the beneficiaries of some of our interventions.
Thank you, Vimbayi. I would like to be respectful for everyone's time, so maybe we can wrap up here. But this was a great webinar. Thanks a lot. And we will continue having other activities. So you can, I will send again the link to join the Slack channel of the ECN. Okay.
Okay, great.
Thanks,
Thank you very much.
everyone.
Thank you.